Everyone is always talking about the best kits, weapons and classes for their little army of units, but never does someone ask, what is the worst weapon I could give my unit? What should I never use and just stick it into the convoy to forget it ever existed? Well, that is exactly the kind of question I want to answer today. We're gonna go past every Fire Emblem game and pick the worst weapon in each. Keep in mind though that I don't mean that purely statistically. This is about utility and what you should actually want to use. Not just purely, oh, this sword has the weakest stats, therefore it's the worst. It's not that simple. We begin with Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, but we start with one of the only weapons the game ever advises you not to use. Now, I have purposefully tried to stay away from joke weapons and stuff like that in this video, since I think they either serve a purpose in weakening enemies for your weak units to get EXP, or they're clearly designed to not be used for anything more than a gag, and so deliver on what they set out to do. The devil weapons kind of fall in a bit of a grey area there, being weapons that, yeah, are clearly harmful to the user and a great risk to use, but at the same time they do serve a purpose. They're a Hail Mary, a last resort, a high risk, high reward weapon that has severe downsides, but also very impressive might, and might very well prove to save your run if you use it at the right time and have some luck. They're not joke weapons, even if Shadow Dragon does advise you to not use them. In clever hands though, they serve a purpose. Well, all but one. Sure, the Devil Axe is not good, let's get that very clear, but at least it has its niche. The original Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light doesn't have silver axes, so the Devil Axe at its 20 might is far and away the strongest axe in the game, with more than double the power of a steel axe. Its hit rate of 70 is less ideal, but also kinda what you'd expect from a high risk, high reward weapon. Don't get me wrong, if you're in the position where using the Devil Axe is necessary, you already messed up, but at least I can see the use of this weapon as an escape button. The Devil Sword? Why would you ever use this? Sure, at first sight it seems better than the Devil Axe. It has a hit of 100 and only a little might less, while also being a lot lighter, but it also has competition. Silver axes may not exist, but silver swords definitely do, and they too have a hit of 100, are even lighter, and only have 5 might less, which is definitely an affordable gap to not have a chance to damage yourself every time you use it. Point being, whenever you need to use a Devil Axe, it is at least the best option you have. Whenever you need to use a Devil Sword, just use a Silver Sword. However, several decades later, when Shadow Dragon on DS was released, the situation changed a little. The Silver Axe now exists, meaning that now the Devil Axe is significantly worse than the Devil Sword, even if its accuracy has been upped and the Silver Axe does not have 100 hit. The might increase of the Devil Axe over the Silver Axe simply is not worth the potential backfire and now makes it worse than the Devil Sword, I would argue. And I quickly want to tackle both versions of Mystery of the Emblem, Original and Remake here as well, because in these games the answer is also undoubtedly the Devil Axe. The original was actually the game to introduce the Silver Axe and immediately made the Devil Axe completely useless. We're talking 5 more might for Lucifer's weapon, but 14 more weight, a lower hit rate and less than half the uses. Why? Why would you ever use the Devil Axe in the original Mystery of the Emblem? Completely pointless. The situation in the DS remake is pretty much identical to the remake of Shadow Dragon, meaning that for the same reasons the Devil Axe once again is the worst, albeit with a smaller lead than in the original game. Next up we pull a Pala and leave Arcania for Valentia, as we tackle Gaiden. Here we won't rope in Shadows of Valentia as well, since the answer simply is completely different. And it's not the Shadow Sword, Gaiden's version of the Devil Sword, either, since I think in this game using it can at least be kinda worth it. At the very least, the difference is big enough to hit that high risk, high reward niche. No, instead, I would say the worst weapon in Gaiden is one that would later in the series prove a borderline essential: the Javelin. Of course, it has the ever-present advantage of being able to hit from range, that shouldn't be disregarded, but in Gaiden, the Javelin has such low might that it barely penetrates anything. Even worse is its awful weight, making it a real detriment on Pegasus Knights. I mean, it's heavier than a silver lance, so what the hell is up with that? And as a cherry on top, it also has poor accuracy, truly making this by far the worst the Javelin has ever been, and arguably the only game where I would advise against using it, at least as anything more than an emergency option. We head to Jugdrall next for Genealogy of the Holy War, where we find another weapon just as pointless as the Devil Axe in Mystery of the Emblem. The simple iron sword is never top tier, but always useful, right? Well, not here. The slim sword exists and is better in literally everything compared to the iron sword. Same weapon rank, higher might, lower weight, better hit, same amount of uses and purchasable as early as chapter 1 as well. Why would you ever use an iron sword then? Well, I don't know. The iron sword here may not be as potentially detrimental as the Devil Axe, but rarely has a weapon in Fire Emblem been this outright pointless. Easy winner. In Thracia, the situation is flipped nearly entirely on its head. Now it's suddenly the slim sword that's the worst and borderline useless. Changes were made to separate the two weapons better, with the iron sword having more might and the slim sword being lighter and having better hit rates. But the thing is, almost all sword users in this game can handle the weight of the iron sword perfectly fine. Usually, the only units you specifically want to outfit with light weapons are Pegasus Knights, but Thracia's only unit to be this class doesn't join until chapter 17, at which point you should have really moved on from slim swords. So yeah, not as useless as Genealogy's iron swords, but definitely not a weapon worth outfitting your units with. We move on to the Binding Blade, where it is widely covered that axes aren't exactly at their peak power. I wouldn't say they're unusable, but their heavy weights and tendency to miss is a real problem when missing is already the name of the game for Binding Blade. Personally, I would say the biggest offender of this common problem is the hammer. Now, of course the hammer has its use in making quick work of bulky armored units, but a useful addition to its power has always been its role as a boss killer, and that is one it painfully fails at in Binding Blade. 45 base hit is already absolutely terrible, which then combined with the thrown bonuses bosses get lead to a situation where it's just useless for one of its most useful purposes. It's not completely without use, and I wouldn't necessarily advise you to avoid it, but I wouldn't advise you to avoid any weapon in this game as long as you see the purpose for it. And as it stands, the amount of purposes the hammer is still useful for is not as big as you would like. All it can do now is smash regular enemies to smithereens, but even then its low hit rate makes it unreliable. When magic is your alternative, that's a problem. For Blazing Blade, we find the winner to be a legendary personal weapon for the first time in the series, but not the last. I would say it is the worst personal weapon the series has ever seen though. I don't think it's a huge surprise to you all that the answer is the Soul Cuddy. How did this happen? The Soul Cuddy is available for one mere chapter as the exclusive weapon for Lyn. She is already not as good as you would want her to be, but the ridiculous weight of the Soul Cuddy just destroys her one redeeming stat, being speed. And what do you get in return? A weapon that has less might than a freaking silver sword. How is that worth it? The sole purpose of this weapon is doing effective damage against the final boss, the Fire Dragon, but in practice it barely does any because its kit is so incredibly terrible and unsuited for the character that Lyn is. Huge shame. In Sacred Stones, we have another winner that dares to consider itself a legendary weapon. I told you we wouldn't just be blindly staring at stats. Gleipnir is a sacred dark tome obtained around chapter 15, depending on the route, and while it does give +5 skill to the user, that's about everything positive I can say about it. 80 hit isn't horrible, but it's also not great, and it has a ridiculous 20 weight, which is way too much for the physically weak little magic users that have access to it. It's also the only sacred weapon in the game to not do effective damage against monsters, which is not essential, but it's definitely kicking it while it's already down. It always feels more painful when a lore important weapon just doesn't work in gameplay, and Gleipnir is one of the worst offenders in the series, I would say. In Path of Radiance we have another late game weapon, albeit it's not a sacred or legendary one. The double bow is the ultimate tease. It's the S rank weapon for archers in our first visit to Tellius and quite hard to obtain in the first place, so it already has convenience going against it from the get-go. But hey, that can sometimes be the most powerful weapons the game has ever seen, so no need to panic yet. The double bow also has a massive range of 4, which is very useful, until you realize it isn't 1 to 4, it's only 4. You can only use this weapon if you're 4 spaces away from the enemy, which, yeah, that's not impossible or anything, but it's far from being as good as 1 to 4 would be. Seeing as not a single enemy unit can hit that range, you can never counterattack when using this weapon. And what do you get in return? Weaker might and hit rate than a steel bow. Again, this is an S rank weapon, it's a late game item. I'm not sure if a weapon with a worse gameplay design than the double bow in Path of Radiance even exists. It's not completely useless, it has a utility no other weapon has, but it's arguably the most offensively bad of all of them. Fortunately, Radiant Dawn increased this weapon's might with a staggering 15 points, so now it's actually really good, and we need to find a new worse weapon for our second go around through Tellius. But if you thought that IS had learned by now that simply giving a weapon additional range is not enough to make it strong, then you'd be wrong. Radiant Dawn introduces various swords that strike at range, and while all of them, Ragnar not included obviously, are dire, the Wind Edge is a special kind of bad. It's literally worse in everything compared to a simple hand axe, with low might and hit and heavy weight. And since the swords with larger range cannot be forged, you're stuck with its basic stats and will find it overclassed by the hardly amazing, but still definitely better Storm Sword and Tempest Blade in no time. The Wind Edge is not completely useless, but it is easily the worst weapon in Radiant Dawn, I would argue. Starting with Awakening, the number of weapons in these games would absolutely explode. And while you would think that would also increase the number of weak weapons, I don't entirely think that is the case. Instead, we get a lot of weapons for niche purposes that have significant flaws, but also unique pros that make keeping them around and at least considering them worth it. I would say the absolute worst, ironically enough, is the Imposing Axe. Another weapon that attempts to be a high risk, high reward utility option. Only problem is, its low 14 might is not even remotely enough to offset its abysmal 35 hit rate. If it had been a buyable item, it might have served this purpose as a Devil Axe strictly for the early game, but since it's not, it's randomly obtained, it cannot be relied upon in more ways than one, and it is definitely the worst weapon those event tiles could ever give you. For Fates, we're not separating the free games, just like we didn't when talking about the best weapon. And this time around, the reason for that is the worst weapon of them all is available in all 3 routes. Found randomly in your castle is Speed Thunder, a slightly stronger version of Thimble Vetter. Only problem, it boosts your enemy's speed after you use it. Let me repeat that. In exchange for slightly more power, it will improve the stats of every single enemy you didn't kill. Why would you ever prefer that over a standard Thimble Vetter? Let alone other magic options. I don't think this is supposed to be a joke weapon, like some others in Fates are, but it's arguably a bigger joke than the pen or the stick could ever dream of being. Want to sit in your convoy forever this. Unlike the other games around this era, Shadows of Valentia stays somewhat true to Gaiden and does not have a massively long list of available weapons. It does expand the number though compared to the original, introducing several new weapons even, one of which is not what you want it to be. Once again, we have a personal weapon winning the questionable title, this time around being Beloved Sophia, an upgraded golden dagger that serves as Celica's personal weapon. First of all, why is this weapon weaker than Alm's equivalent? That already feels unfair. Secondly, for how much is needed in order to upgrade the golden dagger enough, it simply isn't worth it. Sure, a bit of recovery is fine, but Subdue and Swap I don't love, and Ragnarok Omega comes so late that it might as well not be there. If you are now watching this video while playing Echoes and having just forged the Beloved Sophia, then it's not like you completely messed up, it's not unusable or completely outclassed, but it's definitely not worth the trouble when, say, a Lady Blade does the job nearly just as well. Not to mention that the golden dagger is actually usable by everyone and looks pretty nice under the use of, say, Saber or something. Next up is Three Houses, of course, where I'm not gonna separate the routes, despite what I would consider the worst weapon being exclusive to Azure Moon. After all, they are still one game, and I think it's more interesting to talk about the true worst one of all of them. And that, in my opinion, is the Sword of Moralta. Might be a surprise to some, seeing as this is a sacred weapon and belongs to the House of Thraldarius, so Felix, who's hardly a weak unit. And at the surface, it also looks decent, it's under the hood where the problems are. First of all, getting it is similar to Beloved Sophia, not worth it. Having to walk the entire map of chapter 15 just to talk to Rodrigue and get it is quite a hassle, more trouble than it's worth. Secondly, repairing it is costly, as it requires mithril, which is not easy to get and way better spent on weapons that are way more useful than a Sword of Moralta. Its ability to heal every turn is a nice bonus, but Felix doesn't really need it, and it's not like you can give it to anyone else. Combine that all with a disappointing 13 might and 75 hit rate, and you come to the conclusion that this weapon simply isn't worth it. Similar to beloved Sophia, if you already have it, might as well, but it's no way close to being worth the effort and resources it costs to get. And finally, we have Engage. Similarly to Awakening, I would say all weapons in Engage have a decent purpose and niche for which they prove useful, although again, some have a more broad utility than others of course. Out of all of them, the one I would consider the bottom of the barrel, even if not remotely as bad as some other weapons in this video, is the Flame Lance though. This is a lance that can strike from distance and uses the user's magic stat rather than strength to calculate damage. And that's the first problem right there. While you can of course make every character, every class to your own desires, the chances of this weapon being useful are already slim. There are no obvious candidates for who you should use this, and since its might is lower than a freaking steel lance, you also better hurry up, because if you wait too long, just standard weapons already outperform it. Combine this with the fact that the Flame Lance is one of the heaviest lances in the entire game, and it's not looking too good. Sure, you can still use it to break sword users from distance, I guess, but Javelin can do that as well, and more reliably so. Again, not the worst the series has ever seen by a long shot, but I would consider it the worst Engage has to offer. And that has been Every Game. Do you agree with my picks? Share what you would consider the worst weapons in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on all my future Fire Emblem content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.